So let's talk about grunge, which personally I find to be a very unusual subgenre of rock. Like in the mid 80s, early 90s, there are tons of these post-punk alternative styles kind of cropping up everywhere. But I've been avoiding doing a video on grunge just because it's so bizarre for a couple reasons, and I'll get into that. But yeah, it stands out amongst its contemporaries, even just for sheer listens. Artistically, I think it's doing something that people can't get enough of. It's sticky. One of the things I like about grunge is just how improbable it seems. It's this moody thing from the Pacific Northwest, and it's just burrowed itself so deeply in our collective subconscious. It won't stay dead. In this video, we'll explore how the genre started, we'll wax philosophical a bit about its place in pop culture, and figure out the musical characteristics that make it tick. And you won't have to be a music major to understand that, I promise. Also, if you stick around to the end of the video, I'll have some great recommendations that can act as an on-ramp if you're trying to get into the style of music. I'm David Hughes, you're watching Charcuterie Sound. Grab a snack, grab a drink, and let's dive into grunge. So, as you probably already know, in the late 80s and the early 90s, rock music went through a cataclysmic shift in values, in aesthetics, and musical characteristics. The nascent rock subgenres of this period are so completely different than what came before that you could be fooled into thinking that it happened kind of overnight, that there was some sort of invisible consensus to break from the status quo. Thus the term alternative rock, right? Which I've always said, and I still stand by it, that alternative rock is more of an event than a genre. Alternative rock was a splintering. There's shoegaze and hardcore and goth rock. What's happening here is that rock and roll actually started to become more hyper-local again. Whether it was Manchester, or Montreal, or New York, or Dublin, every city had its own scene and its own sound. And they had to. For a moment, the arena shrank behind the humble local rock club. And this is kind of why you have hundreds of answers to the question, where should rock go from here? There's the jangly pop melody indie that's developing in Atlanta with bands like REM, but there's also a new take on punk in New York and DC that's taking off. It's all just very different, but it's also very local. Gone was the glitz and the glamour of the 80s hair rock movement, and what replaced it was something introspective, individualistic, and sardonic even. These alternative subgenres are more unpolished, and grunge was one of these styles that flipped the script on 80s pomp. Although with years of parody and musical evolution, I think we've lost some of what the grunge project was originally about. Let's fix that and get some context. So something you may have heard, and something I've definitely read from music reviewers and music writers, some of which I really respect, is that grunge is just a combination of metal and punk, which to me is an odd take. Clearly there are influences, but saying something like that really smooths out all the details that make grunge unique. You've probably also heard about the Seattle scene, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden. Aesthetically, you probably think of ripped jeans, plaid, the odd moth-bitten cardigan, and that's all part of the aesthetic of the genre. That really is there. But grunge is a more complicated beast, and it's often quite different, I think, than the idea of grunge that lives on in our, popular imagination of the genre. The secret ingredient for grunge really is its time and place, and I think we should really have some special attention reserved for the latter. The grunge sound originates from the Pacific Northwest of the United States. More specifically, Seattle, Washington, and its surrounding area. And this is really important for understanding what grunge is and how it evolved. You see, it rains more in the Pacific Northwest than anywhere else in the United States. Seattle has more cloudy days per year than any other major American city, and it's somewhat geographically isolated and culturally distinct from the rest of the country. And in the mid-80s, when grunge would first cut its teeth, Seattle was hurting. Economically, that is. And then, as now, has become the last stop for Americans traveling from the East Coast looking for something new. The hippie trail that hopped from LA to San Francisco through Portland came to its terminus in Seattle. Also, many larger touring bands didn't bother stopping there, and tickets were expensive anyway. This, of course, didn't stop young people from seeking out live music. and there was plenty available in the smaller rock clubs and bars that dotted the city. And punk was already a popular alternative go-to since at least the early 80s. But the bands in the Seattle scene were starting to do things a little bit differently. Bands like Green River and its offshoot Mudhoney came first. And check out this image of the band Green River, by the way. The grunge aesthetic here was still taking shape from the tattered blue-collar closet of the Northwest, but at this point, it still had a touch of 80s glam mixed with punk subversion. So not quite yet the iconic grunge aesthetic that we're so familiar with today. And another interesting thing here is that a lot of these bands were signed to the same label, Sub Pop. If the gloomy downtown clubs of late 80s Seattle were the incubator for this new subgenre, then Sub Pop was how the rest of America really found out about it. They sold the idea to the United States and the rest of the Anglosphere, and they sold pretty hard. And interestingly, grunge in the late 80s in Seattle was something that you encountered at smaller clubs. It may be something that you're sharing singles, there's some local college radio play, but to the outsider, Sub Pop positioned this new sound as kind of like an alternative to the alternative, something really rare for record collectors and genre heads. That's how they positioned it. Its obscurity had value, and this is something that you see in advertisements from Sub Pop during the era, interviews. Let's look at a particular magazine ad from the early 90s so I can kind of show you what I mean. So the copy reads, and this is actually kind of funny. Hey loser, want to find some action? Tired of being left out? Here at Sub Pop, we just started a special club for lonely record collectors like yourself, the Sub Pop Singles Club. Every month, we'll send you a limited edition 45. They're layering it on pretty thick, so I think you can see what they're going for. And here you can see a pretty good slate of the bands that Sub Pop was collecting. So really, Sub Pop is the reason why grunge didn't just stay this niche local style, but then exploded into something of national interest. So it wasn't necessarily as organic as some people might think. So the first word that might come to mind when you think about grunge could be angst. And that's understandable, as writers and critics love to throw around that word when there are negative emotions expressed through music that are complicated, especially if that music is made by people who are pretty young. But I think labeling this subgenre like that is a little lazy. To me, grunge really has less the unfocused anxiety of angst and provides more of an alternative to it. I've never heard a Gen Xer who came of age during this period mention angst when they talk about grunge. Maybe anger or disinterest, a turn inward, but not angst. And really, I would go so far as to say that angst is what you have when the grunge project fails. Because grunge offers a kind of cultivated disinterest in the status quo. And that doesn't mean that there's no anger here. There definitely is a sarcastic, irreverent anger. It's anger that feels like someone rolling their eyes. And that's not a bad thing. It's also not universal, as we'll see later. Compare that to the anger present in some punk music, which I absolutely love. But punk's anger can sound more like marching orders or outright parody, even a direct polemic takedown. One thing that you'll also hear is that grunge is stripped down or bare bones. It's raw. This is true, I think, especially of earlier grunge. There's an attitude of removal and non-participation. Don't like mall culture? Don't engage with it. Make your own music. Don't polish it. Boil your guitar strings. Don't buy new ones. If an instrument is out of tune on the recording, leave it in. Of course, again, this is not universal, but it is typical of the genre. And this kind of disinterest has been misinterpreted as a passiveness, I think. It's led some critics to view grunge as a sort of giving up, an idea that's been really unfairly connected to Gen Xers in general. Some punk heads dislike grunge for this very reason. Punk is a fight, grunge is just performative self-flagellation. I don't share this view, but I do see punk as being more externally focused, for sure, and grunge more internally, more introspective. To benefit from being vague, punk might tell you why consumerism sucks and how you can help tear it down, where grunge deals more with maybe the phenomenology of living in a world where consumerism's already won. How do you deal with the alienation? And the answer is often a kind of stoic disinterest, sometimes even like a mocking sarcasm. But chiefly, and I think this is what a lot of music writers forget, is that grunge is directed by an aesthetic goal, and it sometimes fails and it sometimes succeeds, but that goal is authenticity. Authenticity and disinterest. Grunge has just taught us that this indifference can be a scream. This depersonalization can be just as sharp as genuine affection. I always think of what Courtney Love said when her and Kurt Cobain received some items from Marc Jacobs. She said, "Mark sent me and Kurt his Perry Ellis grunge collection. Do you know what we did with it? We burned it. We were punkers. We didn't like that kind of thing." But now let's talk about what grunge is musically. Like I mentioned previously, grunge is held together mostly by time and place. It is a broad and varied sound, but that doesn't mean that there aren't a few characteristics that can unite the genre, even if only loosely. Of course, as a child genre of rock and roll, instrument-wise, you have the classic electric guitar, electric bass, a vocalist, and drums. But grunge has its ballads. You can hear nylon string acoustics, pianos, upright bass, and other strings as well. And like many subgenres of rock and roll, the effects applied to the electric guitar really matter. And for grunge, that means distortion. In photos, you often see the Boss DS1 or DS2, and some sort of fuzz, like a big muff. Bass guitars also often have fuzz, but sometimes it's just from being plugged into an overdriven amp. The drums are loud and hard-hitting, but as far as equipment goes, it's usually pretty pared down. There is a lot of focus on crash cymbals and also on toms. And the earlier you go back in the history of grunge, the simpler sets you see. As far as vocals go, two characteristics seem to matter the most. One being melody, and the other being intensity. In verses, vocal melodies are often pretty minimalist, sometimes even slipping into almost monotone delivery. This contrasts heavily with choruses, which are often significantly more energetic. And this is an exciting element that I think is part of grunge's inescapable allure. It's that sweet and salty mix that makes the grunge chorus more memorable and more satisfying. And as far as lyrics go, I'm always surprised by the use of metaphor in grunge. It really is a poetic genre. There's definitely some intentional abstraction here. Something that you'll also often see in grunge is that songs might follow a narrative format, but it also might drift back and forth between dreamlike musings and more straightforward story points. So you may not have realized it, but grunge is kind of having a moment. And it has been for a little while. Many Gen Zs love the stuff. Admittedly, the spotlight of pop culture has kind of shifted more to a Y2K revival, but a grunginess remains. And it's not just wearing band t-shirts for clout. It's backed up by streaming numbers and the anecdotal evidence that every time I go into my local used record shop, just grunge records, they disappear as soon as they hit the floor. That didn't used to be the case 10, 20 years ago. To me, it makes a lot of sense why this clicks with Gen Zs. I'm not a Gen Z, I'm a millennial. But there's that Gen Z prescription of everything cringe. And that definitely has its parallels to the grunge reverence for authenticity. There are definitely still differences. But I think it's time that we do some actual listening and look at some of those recommendations that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. But just a quick reminder before I get to these recommendations, this is just my list. It's mostly just kind of foundational stuff. Your list might be different. You might have added things that I didn't, and you may have omitted things that I added, and that's okay. But yada, 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 let's get into it. Okay, here we are. 6 different grunge albums by 6 different bands. First up, we have Superfuzz Big Muff by Mudhoney. I think this is Mudhoney's most iconic album, if not their best. It's a no skip for me. I would just listen to the whole thing right through. Next up, we have Nevermind by Nirvana, an album that almost needs no introduction. I'm sure you've heard of a lot of songs on this album before, but I do think it's worth going through and listening to it as a complete LP. Third up, we have Temple of the Dog's self-titled Temple of the Dog. Really a fantastic album that brings together a lot of familiar characters from the grunge scene, including members of Pearl Jam and of course the vocalist Chris Cornell of Soundgarden. I particularly recommend the last track, All Night Thing. And of course, much like Nirvana's Nevermind, you can't really talk about grunge without mentioning 10 by Pearl Jam. You really hear the 80s surrender to the new sound of the 90s here. This album really cemented Pearl Jam as well as a permanent fixture of pop culture. And of course, this is going to be a controversial take, but my personal favorite song off the album is the opener, Once. Next up, we have Dirt by Alice in Chains. There are a few Alice in Chains albums that could have made this spot on this list, but I chose Dirt. And lastly, we have Soundgarden's Super Unknown, which displays Chris Cornell's incredible rock vocals with a collection of super hits like Black Hole Sun and Spoon Man. If you liked anything on this list so far, odds are this will become a regular part of your grunge rotation. Anyway, that's it for today. Please like and subscribe if this kind of stuff interests you, and leave a comment if there's a genre or subgenre scene that you'd want me to cover in a future episode. Thanks again, and as always, stay curious, keep listening, and I'll see you next time.